I asked my friend Adam Mixon, when during the week do you feel closest to God? And he said, when I'm commuting to work in traffic. Now, most people find commuting to work stressful. They don't like being in traffic. But to hear Adam tell it, being in traffic is like a moment of grace. He says he looks around and he sees all these different people essentially following the rules. Thousands and thousands of people. And when he's traveling one direction, he realizes he has to trust completely that the other person isn't going to suddenly come across the line. And when you see all these people essentially just agreeing to follow these arbitrary rules so that they can all get someplace on time and usually relatively safely, it's inspiring. When you think about it, it's actually kind of miraculous. I have to admit, that's not the normal way that I think about commuting in traffic. When I'm in traffic, frequently I'm focused on my own stress, on my own suffering. I'm thinking about where I'm supposed to be. I'm living my life in the future. I'm imagining being late. Or I'm living life in the past. I'm thinking about the person who just cut me off and how their cutting me off disrespects me. You know, when I get to where I'm going, I'm sick, I'm tired, I'm frustrated, and I blame it on being stuck in traffic. But I remember seeing a bicycle sticker once that said, "You're not stuck in traffic, you are traffic." See, when I think about myself being stuck in traffic, I stress because I'm not in control. I'm not getting what I want. But when I think about the fact that I am traffic, along with everyone else who has agreed to be on this road, it kind of changes my perspective a little bit. And that reminds me of an insight in Buddhism. We think about suffering as it's somehow not part of life, but life, in fact, is suffering. Buddha says life is traffic. Well, the Buddha actually said it a bit differently. He said life is dukkha, which we translate as suffering. The word's etymology refers to a wobbly axle or a shoulder that's out of joint. Dukkha is the opposite of sukha, when your axle is aligned. But when you're out of joint, you suffer. This is the first noble truth of Buddhism. Life consists of suffering. The second noble truth is that the reason we suffer is that we form attachments to things we can neither really have or enjoy. We have selfish desire. We live our lives in the past that we can't recover, or in the future, which we can't control. It's a little bit like what Jesus says about greed in the Sermon on the Mount. Only he's not just speaking about greed. He says when the eye is unhealthy, the whole body is full of darkness. Something about desire or unhealthy desire has to do with a problem of perception. All of this unhealthy desire the Buddha called tanha, which gets translated as desire or attachment. But what it really means is all the things our false self wants. The third noble truth follows from the second, which is that if suffering is caused by desire, we can overcome suffering by overcoming desire. And the fourth noble truth is good news, gospel. There's a way to do it. It's called the Eightfold Path. So there's four noble truths and an eightfold path. But before we do Buddhism by the numbers, it might help to know a little bit about the man we're talking about. He was born Siddhartha Gautama in India about 500 years before Christ, destined for a life of wealth, power, and luxury, which his society told him, frankly, he completely deserved. But the young man saw something one day. He saw an old person who was so sick and in such pain that it shook him to his core. He was tormented by the question, why is there suffering? And I suspect that maybe he had some guilt and fear that he didn't actually deserve the life he was born into. In my Christian reading of his story, I think grace kind of punctured his confidence in karma and sent him on a journey of seeking. So he renounced his wealth and he went to live the meager life of an ascetic for 6 years. But this didn't bring him any closer to understanding the cause of suffering, though he endured plenty of suffering. Finally, he sat down to meditate under a tree, and he resolved that he wouldn't move until he understood the cause of suffering. He stayed there 6 days, until he had his aha moment. There isn't a cause of suffering, because life is suffering. You aren't stuck in traffic, you are traffic. So when he delivered his first sermon and he gathered his first disciples around him, The Buddha wasn't just explaining a new philosophy or delivering a new religion. He was challenging the existing power structure of Hinduism. See, Buddha taught that anyone of any caste could achieve enlightenment in this life, simply by following his method of training. You didn't have to be born a Brahmin. Someone of low caste could become enlightened just as easily as someone of high caste. He also disregarded a lot of the speculation about God or souls or the afterlife. When people came to him and said, "Are you a prophet? Are you a Brahmin? Are you a god?" he replied simply, "I am awake." And that's what Buddha means. It means the awakened one. Now, I'm a Christian in the Methodist tradition, and so if you know anything about Methodism or John Wesley, you may see why Buddha appeals to me. Buddha taught you could become enlightened in this life. John Wesley taught you can achieve Christian perfection in this life. Both were very controversial, and they challenged the existing status quo. Also, the Buddha was very focused on practice, on the method. Methodists are called Methodists because there was a method, there was a practice to discipleship. Now, when people try to get Buddha to speculate on the supernatural realm, on gods or souls, Buddha kind of dismissed that stuff. He said it's a little bit like someone who's been shot with a poisoned arrow. And before anyone pulls the arrow out, they say, well, wait, first I need to know what kind of poison it is. And then I also need to know what the arrow's made of. And I don't need to know what kind of bow it was. And then I need to know who was the person who shot me. Dummy, just pull the arrow out first and deal with all that other stuff later. Buddhism was focused on extracting the problem that besets all humans. So the Eightfold Path is about extracting the arrow. And the first step is right views. Right views are simply understanding the Four Noble Truths, understanding the cause of suffering and how it can be overcome. The second step is right intent, setting your intention. The idea is you're going to live intentionally instead of being blown about by distractions or blown about by your passions. The third step on the Eightfold Path is right speech. Now, here it's important to recognize that Buddha didn't just say nice things, or if you can't say something nice, don't say nothing at all. He was specifically talking about truth. Observe what you say during the day and notice how often the things you say are intended to distract or deviate from the truth. And often it's to protect our identity. It's to protect our fragile egos. So first we have to observe what we say and observe how often what we say is not rooted in actually just conveying information or expressing care, but really about manipulating power, deceiving other people. So if we observe it first, then we can begin to make steps to change it. The fourth part is right conduct, and this is Buddhism's sort of 10 commandments. There are 5. Don't kill, don't steal, don't lie, don't be unchaste, and don't drink intoxicants. The next step is right livelihood. It's about the ways we choose to make a living and support ourselves. Now, this may seem odd to some of us because oftentimes Christianity has taken steps to accommodate just about any kind of profiteering or way of earning money, even if it exploits other people or harms the planet. But way back in the beginnings of Christian tradition, there was a document called the Didache, and it forbids certain occupations. Like there were certain things Christians shouldn't do, things that involved violence or exploiting other people. In the same way, Buddhism had a prohibition, or has a prohibition against taking occupations that hurt other people or hurt the world or hurt yourself. The sixth step is right effort, and here the idea is that enlightenment is not something that's going to come quickly. It's going to take a lot of work, long, slow, steady work. And if you fall, if you fail occasionally, you get back up, you keep your eyes on the prize, and you keep going. Right effort. The seventh step is right mindfulness. And here the idea is I try to become aware of my thoughts and feelings and senses. I notice them without judgment. And eventually I begin to recognize that I am not my thoughts, my feelings, my senses. And since Buddhism is about overcoming suffering, eventually I want to get to the point where I can encounter something stressful or anxious making, and I am not going to be overwhelmed by it. I'm going to expose myself to the things that sometimes cause me dread or cause ideas of suffering, and it's not going to cause me suffering because with repeated exposure, I'm going to become stronger. So oftentimes Buddhists will meditate on their own death, their own mortality. That's an advanced step. But first, the first step is simply becoming mindful, becoming aware. And as I do so, I begin to also become conscious that I am not who I think I am. If I'm not my thoughts, my senses, and my feelings, what is this thing, this consciousness that I have that's observing and experiencing this? And the more I try to find out what it is, the more I find that it's elusive. The eighth step is right concentration. And here it's important to remember, Buddha was coming out of the Hindu tradition. Hinduism already had a tradition of meditation. Meditation was the practice. This is how you become mindful. Focused meditation, you sit down and you practice mindfulness in meditation so that during the day, the rest of your living, you're mindful all the time. By setting apart 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes, an hour, 2 hours to meditate, you're becoming more mindful and more aware even when you're not in meditation. But you have to practice it through this concentrated meditative effort. Now, some Buddhist traditions talk about various incarnations of the Buddha. And the story is that after the Buddha achieved enlightenment, he had an option. He could stay in this enlightened state, nirvana, by himself, enjoying what it means to be enlightened, or he could return and teach other people about enlightenment. He could bring others along on the path with him. And so in some traditions of Buddhism, the idea is that the Buddha has been incarnate in many generations, has been visiting humanity for a long time, that there's always enlightenment or awakening drawing us toward itself. So some traditions tend to place Buddha on a higher pedestal than others. There's also a famous saying that if you meet the Buddha, kill him. The idea is that we don't deify or worship any particular person as the enlightened one, because the enlightened one is within us all. And if I start thinking of this as something external to myself, I've already missed the mark. So it doesn't literally mean kill the Buddha, but the idea is that Buddha is not supernatural, it's something attainable. Now we need to draw a parallel here to Christianity. I mean, we actually call ourselves Christians. Some people read that as little Christs. We are saying that, look, Christ is in us. We are formed in the image of God. We also talk about Christ being present from the foundation of the world, in all things, through all things. And though we say Jesus is the definitive incarnation, the one that wakes us up, we have to recognize that Christ is already present. Christ plays in 10,000 places, as one poet says. Now, some people consider it blasphemy to say that Christ is in us, or that I am one with Christ. But Jesus says, I am one with the Father, just as you are one with me. Abide in me as I abide in the Father. So there is this sort of mystical sense of unity where Christ is always present. Christ is waiting inside of us to be awakened or be discovered. Christ is not absent from anyone. Jesus' favorite term for himself was not Son of God or Messiah. His favorite term for himself was Son of Man, or sometimes it's translated the human one. In the same way, the Buddha was kind of cagey about his title. He preferred the term awake to any other that people wanted to saddle him with. Neither Buddha nor Jesus wrote down their own teachings, and both of them entrusted their work to be carried on by their disciples. Now, there's a 3,000-year-old history of Buddhism, and Theravada and Mahayana Buddhism are as different as Quakers and Pentecostals or Coptic Christians and Baptists. There's a wide variety of practices and beliefs within Buddhism, just as there is within Christianity. Some Buddhists believe in a supernatural realm populated with all kinds of gods and demons and heavens and hells. Some of these are imported from Hinduism or other regional traditions. Most of the time they're understood symbolically rather than literally. And then again, some Buddhists are a lot more agnostic about those things or atheistic about those things. A belief in Buddhism or the practice of Buddhism doesn't necessarily require you to believe in God or in an afterlife or anything supernatural. There's been a lot of interest in recent years in Buddhism and mindfulness meditation. In part, that's because neuropsychology has revealed that a lot of what Buddhist wisdom has been teaching for 3,000 years is pretty true. We can see it happen in the brain. Mindfulness makes us happier. Mindfulness reduces symptoms of physical pain. Mindfulness improves our relationship. So I think a lot of the wisdom that Buddhism teaches has direct practical benefits for our society. And a lot of fundamentalist Christians in the West have felt threatened by Buddhism and Eastern religious traditions. They see these depictions of gods and supernatural entities as demonic. Some fundamentalist Christians in Alabama passed legislation that prevents teaching meditation or yoga in public schools because they believe that their kids will be subject to Buddhism or Hinduism, and that will open the door to demonic influence and leading them away from Christ. Now, I suspect that one reason that some Christians are very hostile to Eastern religions is because Christianity, in many ways, has become like the Hinduism that Buddha had a problem with. Christianity, in many ways, has become not just a religion about personal salvation, but a justification for the status quo. I mean, if you're poor or you're in a difficult situation of life or you're oppressed, it's probably because you deserve it. And the only hope you have for salvation is after you die and go on to the next life. So if you think about the way that Hinduism had become oppressive in India back in the Buddha's day, I think Christianity has become oppressive in America in our day. This is why I'm grateful that there have been Christians like Thomas Merton, and today we have folks like Richard Rohr and Amy Oden who have shared Buddhist practices from a Christian perspective. And I also need to give a shout out to Thich Nhat Hanh, who is Buddhist and finds lots of points of connection between Buddhism and Christianity. And I think one of the things that Christians can learn from Buddhism is this affirmation that yes, we are fearfully and wonderfully made. We don't actually know what consciousness is. We have a hard time pinning it down. But a life lived with Christian courage, inspired by the Holy Spirit, is one that faces suffering, that faces the things that cause us anxiety, and overcomes them not by avoiding them, but by confronting them. I'm also going to give you a few sort of starter questions to begin your group discussion. First, what do you think of the Four Noble Truths about suffering and attachment? Do you find this idea liberating or not? Second, Jesus says, "My way is easy and my burden is light." Jesus also says the way to salvation is a narrow way and few find it. Does the Eightfold Path that the Buddha talks about, does it sound easy or does it sound hard to you? And finally, does it change your perception of traffic to realize that you're not stuck in traffic, that you are traffic? Can you do something similar with your perception of your own life?